If Earth wanted revenge, today would have been the easiest day to start a war. The sentence flashed across every major news feed in known space before sunrise on July 4th, and within minutes the entire galaxy had already decided what humanity would do next. The Varkan Empire had crossed a line no civilized government could ignore. 3 weeks earlier, they had seized Horizon Relay, a civilian supply station near the edge of the Seoul Trade Corridor, detained hundreds of innocent workers, and declared the station lawful imperial property. Every request for negotiations had been dismissed with the same cold response. The relay now belonged to the Empire. Earth was free to complain if it wished. Across the Galactic Council, analysts filled conference rooms, admirals studied fleet projections, and political commentators confidently predicted the opening shots of another interstellar conflict. Every telescope pointed toward human space. Every military sensor watched for carriers, destroyers, and battle groups leaving orbit around Earth. They expected anger. They expected missiles. They expected the familiar rhythm of pride answering pride. Instead, nothing happened. The orbital docks above Earth remained strangely quiet. Massive warships stayed locked in their berths. Long-range scanners detected no unusual fleet movements, no emergency mobilization, not even reserve patrols leaving lunar defense stations. The silence became unsettling. Inside the council chamber, Chancellor Threx stood before representatives from more than 200 worlds with the confidence of someone who believed he understood human nature. Nearly 8 feet tall, with smooth silver-gray skin and sharp, elegant features, he folded his hands behind his back and allowed himself a satisfied smile. "It appears," he announced, "that Earth has finally recognized reality." Soft laughter echoed through the enormous chamber. Several delegates nodded in agreement. Humanity had always talked about freedom, fairness, and diplomacy, but today, according to them, those ideals had finally collided with real power. Meanwhile, nearly 40,000 light-years away in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Daniel Mercer quietly adjusted the knot of his navy blue tie while standing beside a polished wooden table inside the State Department. He looked more like an accountant preparing for a long meeting than the representative of a civilization many expected to declare war before lunch. His assistant, Sarah Collins, placed a digital briefing tablet beside him. "The Council is already calling this a surrender," she said carefully. Daniel glanced at the screen for barely a second before sliding it aside. "People usually mistake patience for fear," he replied with a tired smile. "That has happened before." Sarah hesitated. "Sir, if we are not sending the fleet, what exactly are we sending?" Daniel looked toward a simple rectangular box resting on the table. It was wrapped in dark blue cloth with a ribbon woven in red, white, and blue. Nothing about it looked expensive. Nothing about it suggested power. It looked like something a grandfather might carry to a family picnic on Independence Day. Daniel gently picked it up with both hands. "A gift," he answered. Sarah blinked. "That is all." He nodded once. Sometimes the right gift weighs more than an entire navy. An hour later, as billions of viewers watched across countless worlds, a single unarmed diplomatic courier departed Earth. No escort fighters followed behind it. No battleships shadowed its course. The only thing crossing the darkness between Seoul and the Council was one small vessel carrying one ordinary-looking package. And not a single person laughing inside the council chamber realized that history had already changed the moment Earth chose not to send warships. The diplomatic courier settled onto the landing platform outside the Galactic Council without ceremony. No honor guard assembled. No military escort stepped forward. A few reporters watched from behind the security line, whispering to one another as if they had been promised a historic confrontation and instead received a delayed delivery. Ambassador Daniel Mercer stepped down the narrow ramp, carrying the blue-wrapped box with both hands. He walked at an unhurried pace, offering a polite nod to the security officers who scanned his credentials. One young council clerk looked at the package and frowned. "That is all you brought?" Daniel smiled. "That is enough." The clerk exchanged an uncertain glance with his supervisor before allowing him through. Inside the Grand Council chamber, thousands of seats curved around the massive circular floor where governments settled disputes that could shape entire star systems. Cameras floated silently overhead, broadcasting every movement to billions of viewers. Chancellor Threx remained standing at the center platform, clearly enjoying the attention. "Welcome back, Ambassador Mercer," he said with a voice that carried easily across the chamber. "I was beginning to wonder whether Earth had decided to stay home." A ripple of laughter spread through the audience. Daniel stopped exactly where protocol required and placed the wrapped box carefully on the polished black table between them. "Earth always keeps its appointments," he answered. "Even difficult ones." Vaylor slowly circled the package as though inspecting something beneath his station. "Our intelligence expected battle cruisers." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Intelligence is only useful when it understands people." More laughter echoed from several delegations. One senator from the core worlds leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for nearby microphones to capture it. "Perhaps the humans ran out of ships." Daniel heard the remark, but showed no reaction. Years earlier, comments like that might have bothered him. Now they reminded him of boardroom meetings where people underestimated quiet employees until quarterly numbers arrived. Sarah Collins stood several feet behind him, resisting the urge to respond. She had learned that Daniel rarely defended himself with words when time could do the job better. Chancellor Vaylor finally rested one hand on the package. "So this," he announced dramatically, "is Earth's response to the occupation of Horizon Relay." Daniel gave a single nod. "Yes." "No demands." "No." "No threats." "None." "No declaration." "No." Vaylor smiled wider with every answer. "Interesting. Then perhaps humanity has finally accepted that some losses cannot be recovered." Daniel folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "Every nation decides what it wishes to send into history. Today we chose this." The Chancellor looked almost disappointed. He expected anger, arguments, perhaps even desperate bargaining. Instead, he found himself speaking to a man who sounded as though he were attending a neighborhood town meeting instead of the most watched political event in the galaxy. Around the chamber, commentators began publishing instant reactions. Human resolve had collapsed. Earth had accepted imperial authority. Diplomacy had replaced resistance. One analyst confidently predicted that trade markets would stabilize before the end of the week. Daniel quietly glanced toward the gallery where students from several member worlds had been invited to observe the proceedings. They looked confused. They had grown up hearing that humans were unpredictable, yet the representative from Earth seemed remarkably ordinary. He noticed one young alien child staring curiously at the ribbon around the package instead of the politicians arguing around it. Daniel smiled back for just a moment before returning his attention to the Chancellor. Vaylor tapped the top of the box with one finger. "Very well, Ambassador. Since Earth insists this package deserves the attention of the galaxy, let us all discover what your civilization believes is more valuable than a fleet." Chancellor Vaylor untied the ribbon with slow, exaggerated care, pausing twice so the hovering cameras could capture every angle. The chamber had become so quiet that the faint rustle of the blue cloth seemed louder than the whispers that had filled the room only moments before. Several delegates leaned forward, expecting hidden technology, a diplomatic ultimatum, or perhaps some ingenious human weapon disguised as a gift. Instead, when the lid lifted, confusion spread almost immediately. Inside rested an old brass key, polished by time instead of machines, a neatly folded handwritten letter, and a crystal data drive resting inside a simple wooden holder. That was all. Vaylor stared into the box before letting out a soft laugh. "This is disappointing," he said. "I expected humanity to be more creative." A wave of chuckles rolled through the chamber. One delegate quietly muttered, "Perhaps they forgot the real gift." Another replied, "Perhaps this is all they could afford." Daniel Mercer remained perfectly still. His face showed no embarrassment, no frustration. Only the calm expression of someone waiting for others to finish making assumptions. Vaylor picked up the brass key between two fingers. "Primitive craftsmanship," he observed. "Surely your museums have better artifacts than this." Daniel answered without raising his voice. "That key has never belonged in a museum." The Chancellor ignored him and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page before he read it aloud with obvious amusement. "From Earth, on the day we celebrate freedom." He stopped and looked around the chamber with a theatrical smile. How sentimental. More laughter followed. Even several neutral observers smiled politely, believing they had just witnessed humanity's attempt to save face with symbolism instead of strength. Sarah Collins felt the weight of every sarcastic glance directed toward the human delegation, But Daniel did not even blink. He simply watched the Chancellor finish reading. Valor placed the letter back inside the box and picked up the crystal drive. "Is this supposed to inspire us?" he asked. "Or is this another human holiday tradition?" Daniel finally spoke. "Play the recording." The Chancellor tilted his head. "There is nothing else. The recording is the gift." Valor hesitated for only a second before handing the crystal drive to one of the council technicians. "Very well. Let the galaxy enjoy humanity's final performance." The technician inserted the crystal into the central archive console. For a brief moment, the enormous display remained dark. Then the screen flickered to life. It did not show soldiers. It did not show politicians. Instead, a little human girl with bright eyes and a wide smile appeared sitting at a folding table covered with paper, crayons, and colored pencils. She looked no older than 9. Around her sat several alien children from different member worlds, all trying their best to draw fireworks across white sheets of paper. The girl laughed as one of the younger children accidentally colored outside the lines. "That is okay," she said warmly. "Fireworks are supposed to be messy." The children laughed with her. She picked up a blue crayon and carefully drew stars across the page. "Today is my favorite holiday," she continued. "My dad says freedom means nobody gets to own your future. That is why we celebrate together." The room grew noticeably quieter. The recording continued with children exchanging drawings, comparing homemade flags, and smiling at one another without caring which planet they had come from. There were no speeches, no politics, just ordinary families sharing an afternoon before everything changed. Daniel Mercer quietly looked around the chamber, watching expressions shift almost one face at a time. Some delegates looked uncomfortable. Others lowered their eyes. Chancellor Valor folded his arms and forced a dismissive smile. "A touching family video," he said, "but I fail to see why this deserves the attention of the Galactic Council." Daniel met his eyes without the slightest trace of anger. "Because that recording was made at Horizon Relay less than 2 hours before your forces arrived. Watch the rest of it before deciding what Earth actually sent you." The screen remained still for several long seconds after the children finished laughing. No dramatic music followed. No narrator interrupted the silence. Then the image shifted naturally as the little girl adjusted the camera with both hands. "Dad is calling," she said with a grin. "He wants everybody to come outside because the station lights are about to turn on." Several alien children hurried after her, each carrying their drawings. One little boy with pale blue skin held up a picture of fireworks beside Earth's flag. "Do I get the colors right?" he asked. She smiled. "You made them your colors. That is even better." A few delegates quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Some recognized the children. One elderly representative from the Keeler Union leaned forward until his translator nearly slipped from his shoulder. "That is Governor Sellen's grandson," he whispered. Across the chamber, another delegate suddenly froze. "My niece is there." The recording continued through bright station corridors filled with ordinary families carrying shopping bags, birthday balloons, grocery containers, and holiday decorations. Nobody looked frightened. Nobody expected history to remember that afternoon. A human father appeared beside the camera carrying a cardboard box filled with small paper flags. "Ready for the picnic?" he asked. The little girl nodded excitedly. "Can everybody come?" "Everybody is already invited," he answered. That is how holidays work back home. One by one, alien children reached into the box and picked a small flag without anyone telling them which one belonged to which planet. They simply laughed together while trying to tape colorful decorations across the community center windows. Daniel Mercer watched the reactions inside the council far more carefully than he watched the recording itself. He had memorized every second months earlier. What interested him now was not the screen. It was the room. Faces that had arrived confident now looked uneasy. Smiles disappeared. The cameras quietly drifted from the display toward delegates whose expressions were changing faster than the conversation around them. Chancellor Valor folded his arms more tightly. "This proves nothing," he declared. "A pleasant gathering does not alter the legal status of Horizon Relay." Daniel answered calmly. "Keep watching." The recording advanced another few minutes. A station announcement sounded gently through the hallway. The voice welcomed residents to the annual community celebration and reminded everyone that all children were invited to participate regardless of citizenship or homeworld. Several parents waved toward the camera. Others laughed as the youngsters compared homemade drawings of fireworks, planets, and stars. Then the picture paused automatically. A timestamp appeared in one corner of the screen, 2 hours before the occupation. Beneath it, another line of authenticated council archive data appeared without anyone touching the controls. Location verified. Civilian Education Wing. Public Community Recording. Original archive signature confirmed. The technician operating the console looked startled. "Chancellor," he said carefully. "The authentication comes from the council archive itself. This file has never been altered." A low murmur spread through the chamber. Daniel finally stepped forward one pace. His voice remained quiet enough that everyone instinctively leaned in to hear it. Those children came from 11-member worlds. Every family on that recording trusted this council to protect a civilian station. Earth did not bring you accusations today. Earth brought you your own memory. Vaylor stared at the frozen image of smiling children covering the enormous display. For the first time since the session began, he did not answer immediately. The silence inside the council chamber stretched long enough for every live commentator to stop talking. Chancellor Vaylor slowly placed the brass key back into the box as though it had suddenly become heavier than it looked. He forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Memories are emotional," he said. "Governments operate on law." Daniel Mercer nodded once. "Exactly." He reached into his briefcase and removed a thin paper folder instead of a digital tablet. Several delegates looked puzzled. Paper had become almost ceremonial centuries earlier. Daniel carefully opened the folder and laid a single document beside the box. "Your archive identified the recording as authentic," he said. "Now I would like the council to identify this." The chief records officer accepted the document and slid it into the central scanner. Within seconds, the enormous display above the chamber filled with official seals carrying the unmistakable insignia of the Galactic Council itself. Archive Record 7 Alpha. Emergency Preservation Order. Classification locked. Authorization Level Supreme Council. A quiet gasp traveled across the room. The records officer swallowed. This authorization predates Chancellor Vaylor's administration by almost 2 centuries. Daniel answered softly. "Please continue reading." The officer hesitated before speaking again. "The preservation order instructs that all evidence related to civilian relocations, labor settlements, and territorial acquisitions conducted by the Varkan Empire shall remain sealed to preserve political stability among member worlds." Several delegates stood halfway out of their seats. One demanded, "Read the next section." The officer looked visibly uncomfortable. "Disclosure prohibited without unanimous council approval or presentation of the original access instrument." Daniel gently picked up the old brass key from the table. "This," he said, holding it where every camera could see, "is the original access instrument." The chamber fell completely still. Vaylor immediately shook his head. "Impossible. That key disappeared generations ago." Daniel looked directly at him. "No. It was returned to Earth by a council archivist who believed someone, someday, would have the courage to finish the job." Sarah Collins quietly placed another sealed envelope beside the first one. Daniel did not rush. He never raised his voice. He simply waited while curiosity replaced certainty throughout the room. 3 months ago," he continued, "Earth completed the legal chain of custody required under your own charter of interstellar accountability. We did not hack your archives. We did not steal classified records. We followed every rule your government wrote, every signature, every deadline, every appeal." The records officer slowly nodded as he reviewed the authentication trail. "He is correct," he admitted. "The documentation is complete." Murmurs turned into open conversations across the chamber. Delegates who had arrived expecting military threats now found themselves studying legal procedures instead. Daniel folded his hands. The Varkan occupation of Horizon Relay is not the beginning of today's discussion. It is the final page of a story your archives have been hiding for 200 years. Vaylor's confidence continued to fade. "Even if sealed records exist," he argued, "opening them could destabilize the entire galaxy." Daniel gave a tired smile that carried more sadness than satisfaction. Truth often does. He looked around the chamber at representatives from dozens of civilizations. Earth did not send this key to unlock a vault. Earth sent it to unlock your conscience. No one laughed this time. Every delegate understood that whatever waited behind those sealed archives would not simply rewrite history. It would force an entire galaxy to decide whether peace built on forgotten truths had ever been peace at all. No alarms sounded when the archive opened. There was no dramatic countdown, no hidden weapon waiting behind the seal. Instead, rows upon rows of ordinary records filled the massive display. Shipping manifests, census reports, school registrations, property transfers, family relocation requests. It looked almost boring until people began reading the names. One delegate slowly stood from his seat. That colony, my grandparents came from there. Another voice echoed from the upper gallery. Those districts were never supposed to exist. The records officer continued scrolling through authenticated council files, each one carrying the same official seal that nobody in the room could dispute. Entire communities had disappeared from public history, not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been quietly absorbed, renamed, and filed away under administrative language so dry that almost no one had questioned it. Daniel Mercer remained silent while the room absorbed what it was seeing. Sarah Collins leaned slightly closer. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. "I hoped it would." On the central display, another folder opened automatically. It contained thousands of personal messages submitted by civilians over generations. Parents searching for relatives. Teachers requesting updated school records. Local governors asking why entire neighborhoods no longer appeared on official maps. Every request had received nearly the same response. Administrative review pending. Classification restricted. Jurisdiction transferred. No final answer had ever been sent. The chamber no longer sounded like a political assembly. It sounded like people recognizing forgotten pieces of their own family histories. Chancellor Vaylor stepped toward the console. "Enough," he said firmly. "These documents require careful verification before public interpretation." The chief records officer did not move. "Chancellor, every file has already been verified by the council archive over the last 200 years. Vaylor frowned. "Then suspend public transmission." Before anyone could touch the controls, the communications technician quietly cleared his throat. "We cannot." Vaylor turned sharply. "Explain." The archive was configured under the original preservation order. Once legally opened with the authenticated access instrument, every member world automatically receives synchronized public copies. The distribution began 4 minutes ago. The room fell silent again. Daniel looked toward the enormous star map floating above the chamber. Small points of light were beginning to appear across it, each representing another member world confirming receipt of the archive. 1 became 10. 10 became hundreds. Within moments, thousands of public libraries, universities, local governments, and historical societies were downloading the same records simultaneously. Nobody on Earth had pressed a secret button. Nobody had launched a cyber attack. The Council's own legal system had carried the truth farther than any human fleet ever could. Sarah looked at Daniel with quiet amazement. "You trusted their laws." He smiled faintly. "We trusted that somebody, somewhere, still believed in them." Reports immediately began arriving from across known space. Historians requested emergency conferences. Governors postponed legislative sessions. Families started searching old databases for familiar names. News organizations interrupted scheduled programming to compare the newly released records with official history books. Chancellor Vaylor watched the updates appear one after another across the chamber walls. For the first time all day, he seemed less concerned about Earth than about the questions now spreading through his own civilization. Daniel gently closed the empty gift box and rested one hand on its lid. He spoke so quietly that the microphones barely caught his words. "We did not send soldiers because soldiers cannot make people remember. The truth can. Once people choose to read it, no empire can order them to forget again." While the council chamber struggled to process the flood of newly released records, another screen quietly came to life above the main assembly. It was not a military alert. It was a routine navigation report from the Outer Rim. A Varkan task force had departed 3 occupied sectors and was now moving toward the Sol frontier. The movement was perfectly legal under existing patrol agreements, yet everyone understood the message behind it. Chancellor Vaylor noticed the report first. His confidence returned just enough for a thin smile. "There it is," he said. "Reality always arrives eventually." Several delegates looked toward Daniel Mercer, expecting his calm expression to finally crack. It did not. Sarah Collins glanced at the update, then back at Daniel. General Hale is asking whether Earth should raise fleet readiness, she said quietly after reading an encrypted message on her wrist display. Daniel did not even ask for the tablet. He simply replied, "Tell General Rebecca Hale to maintain the current posture." Sarah blinked. No changes. No changes. Not even precautionary deployments. Daniel shook his head. No. Thousands of miles beneath the Rocky Mountains, inside the North American Defense Command, General Rebecca Hale stood before a wall of tactical displays showing the approaching Varkan formation. Officers moved briskly between consoles, waiting for orders that never came. One Navy commander finally broke the silence. "Ma'am, we can have 2 carrier groups in position within 6 hours." Rebecca folded her arms and looked at the latest transmission from Washington. The message contained only one sentence. "Hold the line. Do not fire first." She smiled faintly. "The ambassador has not changed." An Air Force colonel looked puzzled. "Are we really going to wait?" Rebecca picked up her coffee, now completely cold, and stared at the star map. Daniel Mercer has been representing Earth for 22 years. Every time people assume he is buying time, he is actually giving someone else a chance to make the right decision. Back inside the council, reports from the approaching Varkan ships continued arriving every few minutes. Yet something unexpected began appearing alongside them. Crew communications were slowing. Internal command confirmations were arriving late. Several captains requested clarification of orders that would normally have been executed immediately. Then came the first unusual transmission. A Varkan commander requested permission to contact his family before continuing the mission. Another asked headquarters whether newly released archive records concerning his home colony were authentic. A third requested access to sealed historical files that had been unavailable only an hour earlier. The questions spread from one vessel to another with remarkable speed. Nobody had jammed their communications. Nobody had sabotaged their navigation. They were simply reading. Daniel watched the incoming reports without satisfaction. If anything, he looked quietly relieved. Vaylor frowned as another update appeared. "Minor delays," he insisted. "Nothing more." The communications technician swallowed before speaking. "Chancellor, several captains are requesting independent verification of imperial history before proceeding." Another message arrived. Then another. One formation reduced speed without authorization. A logistics vessel turned around to rendezvous with civilian transports instead of continuing toward the frontier. Sarah looked at Daniel. "You knew this would happen too." He slowly exhaled. "No. I knew people would ask questions once they had the chance." He looked toward the stars displayed across the ceiling of the chamber. People who believe they are protecting their families deserve to know what really happened to the generations that came before them. For the first time that day, the approaching fleet no longer looked like an unstoppable wall of ships. It looked like thousands of ordinary people trying to decide whether loyalty demanded obedience or honesty. The first official resignation arrived 23 minutes after the archive became public. It came from Governor Narex of the Eastern Protectorates, a leader who had spent nearly 30 years defending imperial policy before discovering that his own great-grandparents had been listed among the relocated families hidden inside the sealed records. His statement was only 42 words long. "I cannot ask others to defend history until I understand my own." Then another resignation appeared. Then another. The chamber filled with quiet notification tones as governments across the galaxy issued emergency statements, opened independent investigations, or called for public hearings. Nobody had fired a shot. Nobody had crossed a border. Yet the balance of power was shifting in plain sight. Chancellor Vaylor stepped toward the center platform, his voice suddenly sharper than before. "This is exactly why those records remained sealed. Order depends upon stability." Daniel Mercer looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried all day. "No, Chancellor. Stability depends upon trust." Vaylor pointed toward the growing list of governments questioning imperial history. "You have created chaos." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Questions are not chaos. They are how free people decide what kind of future they want." Across the chamber, delegates who had remained silent throughout the hearing finally began speaking. A representative from the Thalen Republic requested an independent historical commission. A delegate from the Oris Confederation proposed suspending all territorial disputes until every archive could be reviewed publicly. Another government formally requested unrestricted access to every sealed council record still under classification. Sarah Collins quietly watched the voting board begin to light up with support from worlds that had rarely agreed on anything. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered, "I do not think they are following Earth anymore." Daniel gave the smallest smile. That was never the plan. The communications technician interrupted again. New report from the frontier. Every face turned toward the main display. The Varkan task force had stopped advancing. Several ships had powered down long-range weapons and requested direct communication with civilian authorities instead of military headquarters. One captain submitted a public message rather than a classified report. His words appeared across the enormous screen. "Before I continue carrying out these orders, I request confirmation that my family's history has not been withheld from me." The chamber became so quiet that even the floating camera drones seemed to hesitate. Valor closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "You have turned disciplined officers into doubters." Daniel answered softly, almost with sympathy. "No, someone else did that the day the truth was hidden from them." He rested one hand on the now empty gift box. Earth simply stopped helping keep the secret. A young delegate sitting near the back slowly rose to speak. She had remained silent through the entire session, taking notes instead of joining the arguments. "Ambassador Mercer," she asked, "if Earth knew this would weaken your greatest rival, why did you not simply use your fleet from the beginning?" Daniel looked around the chamber before answering. His voice was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. "Because my father served in the military. He taught me something when I was 12 years old. Winning without giving people a chance to choose peace is only another way of losing tomorrow." Nobody applauded. Nobody argued. The words simply settled over the chamber as every representative realized that humanity had walked into the greatest political confrontation in modern history, carrying no army, no threats, and no demands. Only enough patience to let an entire galaxy discover the truth for itself. 3 days later, the emergency session of the Galactic Council officially came to an end, but almost nobody remembered the closing speeches. They remembered something much quieter. One by one, representatives walked to the center table, not to congratulate Earth or condemn the Empire, but to read the names that had finally returned from the sealed archives. Families found lost branches of their histories. Cities restored their original records. Schools announced that history textbooks would be rewritten before the next academic year. The Varkan task force never reached the Sol frontier. Most of its captains requested independent review panels before accepting new assignments. Others returned to their home systems to speak with parents, grandparents, and veterans whose stories suddenly made sense for the first time. The greatest military crisis of the century slowly dissolved into thousands of ordinary conversations around dinner tables. Daniel Mercer stood near one of the chamber windows overlooking the stars while technicians packed away cameras and translation equipment. Sarah Collins joined him carrying the empty blue cloth that had wrapped the gift box. "You should probably keep this," she said with a smile. Daniel laughed softly. "My wife will ask why I brought home an empty box." Sarah looked across the nearly empty chamber. "Do you think people will remember your speech?" Daniel glanced toward the table where the brass key still rested beneath protective glass. "No," he answered. "People rarely remember speeches." "Then what will they remember?" He watched several alien children walking through the visitors' gallery with sketchbooks tucked under their arms. One of them had drawn fireworks above dozens of different worlds connected by the same sky. Daniel smiled. Hopefully they remember that little girl who shared her crayons. Months passed. Horizon Relay reopened, not as an imperial outpost or a military station, but as a jointly administered civilian center. The community room from the recording was rebuilt almost exactly as it had appeared that afternoon. Parents from dozens of worlds volunteered to repaint the walls. Someone framed copies of the children's original drawings beside the entrance. Every year afterward, visitors stopped in front of one picture showing blue stars, red fireworks, and smiling faces from planets separated by light years, but sitting around the same folding table. The artist's name remained written in careful block letters across the bottom. Lily Carter. On Earth, Daniel finally returned home after the longest diplomatic mission of his career. His grandchildren met him on the front porch just before sunset, carrying a small box of sparklers for the neighborhood celebration. "Grandpa," one of them asked, Did you save the galaxy? Daniel smiled as he knelt beside them. No. Then what did you do? He looked toward the evening sky, where the first fireworks were beginning to bloom above the trees. I reminded some people that the truth belongs to everyone. Years later, historians argued about treaties, elections, and political reforms, but children across the galaxy learned a much simpler story. They learned that one civilization had every reason to answer fear with fear and anger with anger, yet chose something harder. They chose patience. They chose honesty. They chose to trust that ordinary people, once given the truth, could build a better tomorrow than any army ever could. And somewhere in the restored archive, beside an old brass key and a faded handwritten letter, one sentence remained preserved for every generation that followed. Freedom is never the greatest gift because you can wrap it in a box. Freedom becomes the greatest gift only when you decide to share it with someone who has never been allowed to believe it was theirs.